So hi, this is the first video of what I hope is going to be a pretty long series of videos. Um, so based on what feedback I got regarding my idea, I figured it's best to start with neuroanatomy. So neuroanatomy, the way we were taught at college, we began with the spinal cord. So that's how I'm going to start. This video will basically be me talking about my revision notes. It's kind of a self-update, it's for me, but I'm going to post it so that anyone who's interested can access it whenever they want. So the topic for today is spinal cord, and I'll be starting with the student learning objectives, the SLOs. The SLOs are 5 here. First is to define the spinal cord and talk about its functions, to describe the positional changes of the spinal cord and spinal nerves at various stages of development, to describe the spinal coverings and the basis of lumbar puncture, to define spinal segments and their relation with vertebral levels, to define important tracts. Let's start with the definition of the spinal cord. The length of the spinal cord is 42 to 45 centimeters. Typically, it's about 42 centimeters in females and 45 centimeters in males. The extent of the spinal cord is from the upper border of the first cervical vertebra to the lower border of the first lumbar vertebra. The lowest extent of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris, which can also be called an apex. The conus medullaris continues as the filum terminale, and the spinal cord is defined as the lower elongated part of the central nervous system. The functions of the spinal cord is the execution of simple reflexes and the transmission of impulses to and fro from the brain to the body. Following are the positional changes of the spinal cord. This is important to consider for the clinical basis of lumbar puncture. Till the 3rd month of intrauterine life, the spinal cord covers the full length of the vertebra. At birth, the spinal cord terminates at the 3rd lumbar vertebra, and in the adult life, it ends at the lower border of L1 or the disc between L1 and L2, which is why the intervertebral spaces below this point is ideal to use for lumbar puncture so that we do not puncture any spinal nerves. So this diagram is a schematic representation of what we can expect the spinal cord to be. By the 3rd month, the yellow tube is the spinal cord and it's covering the entire vertebra. And the orange colored line represents the S1 nerve. And again, at birth, the yellow conus medullaris is terminating at around L3. And by the time the person is an adult, it terminates at L1. Now we come to spinal meninges. So considering that the black part in the center is the gray matter found in the spinal cord, these are the coverings that can be found in the spinal cord. The dura mater is the outermost layer, followed by the arachnoid and then the pia mater. And here goes the intervertebral foramen. This is the dorsal and the ventral ramus of the spinal nerves. And here is a special projection of the pia mater or the pia mater, whichever you prefer, which is called ligamentum denticulata. So another important thing that we need to learn is the differences between spinal and cranial dura. So the spinal dura has only one layer, which is the meningeal layer. The cranial dura has 2 layers. There's also an outer endosteal layer along with the meningeal layer. The spinal dura forms folds. The spinal dura does not form folds, and the cranial dura forms folds. There is the presence of epidural space in the spinal dura, and no epidural space is present in the cranial dura. I'll repeat it again because I made a mistake the first time I said it. The spinal dura has only one layer, which is the meningeal layer. The cranial dura has two layers because it has an extra outer endosteal layer. The spinal dura does not form any folds, and the cranial dura does form folds. Folds such as falx cerebri, tentorium cerebelli, etc. The spinal dura has an epidural space. The cranial dura has no epidural space. With this slight differentiation between the spinal and the cranial dura, we go to an explanation about the dura mater present in the spinal cord, which is the space between the spinal dura and the epidural canal is called the epidural space, and the dura mater as well as the arachnoid mater extend till S2, the second sacral vertebra. That's it about the dura mater. The arachnoid mater, there's nothing much given about it in the textbook I refer to, except for the fact that arachnoid mater forms arachnoid granulations. Pia mater is the innermost layer and apparently the most important layer of the three meningeal coverings of the spinal cord. So here follows a somewhat detailed explanation of this pia mater. The pia mater continues till below the spinal cord till the filum terminale. Alright, and the lumbar cistern or subarachnoid space is present here. Projections of pia mater. Following are the projections of pia mater, which can form a pretty important question, which is the filum terminale. The filum terminale, it starts at the end of the spinal cord at the conus medullaris, and it extends till the first coccygeal vertebra. It contains the nerves of the second coccygeal till the fourth coccygeal rudiments. Okay? And filum terminale has two parts, filum terminale internum and filum terminale externum. Filum terminale internum is present inside the dural sac and it extends till like 15 millimeter. Filum terminale externum is present outside the dural sac and it extends till 5 millimeter below the filum terminale internum. Then we come to the subarachnoid septum. Subarachnoid septum is a mid-sagittal fenestrated septum which connects the pia mater to the arachnoid mater. The third projection of pia mater is linea splendens, which is a thickening of the septum at the anterior median fissure. And the last was featured in the picture that was there in the previous page over here, and it is the ligamentum denticulata. The ligamentum denticulata is a projection shaped like a tooth which anchors the spinal cord to the subarachnoid space. It's a ribbon-like projection between anterior and posterior roots. Now we come to the spinal segments. Spinal segments basically refers to the part of the spinal cord to which a spinal nerve pair is attached to. There are a total of 31 spinal segments, and because of the position of the spinal cord which terminates before the vertebra, here is a table which lists the position of the spinal segments in comparison to the position of the vertebral segments. So in the it's segregated region wise, as you can clearly see here. The upper cervical region which starts and extends from the second cervical vertebra to the sixth cervical vertebra and the second cervical spinal nerve till the sixth cervical spinal nerve. Basically, from C2 to C5, the spinal and the vertebral segments are the same, at the same level. At the lower cervical vertebrae, from C6 spinal nerve to C8 spinal nerve, the rule is that the C6 will be present at C5. Like one above this particular spinal nerve would be the vertebral level. Alright, and then we come to the upper thoracic. At about T5, the vertebral level will be T3. So the rule here is that the nerve is present about 2 vertebral levels higher than it should be, if the position of the spinal cord was ideal, which it isn't. And then we come to the lower thoracic. The spinal nerve of T10 is present at the vertebral level of T7, which means the rule is plus 3 thoracic vertebrae. Lumbar vertebrae L1 to L5. Spinal nerves are present in the T2 to T10 to T11 space, which means the rule is about 3 to 5 depending on which nerve we are talking about. Sacral and coccygeal S1 to S5 and C1 are present between T12 to L1, which means they are about 6 to 10 vertebral levels above what they should be. Now comes almost the most important part of the chapter, which is the tracts of the spinal cord. This is a very schematic diagram of most of the tracts of the spinal cord, and the tracts given in this diagram will be explained in the following pages. So a very important point that we need to note here is that ascending tracts are as a rule sensory tracts, and descending tracts are as a rule motor tracts. So some of the very important descending tracts are corticospinal tracts, ribero-spinal tracts, reticulospinal tract, and olivospinal, tectospinal and vestibulospinal tracts. Alright, and the descending tracts are corticospinal tract, hypothalamospinal tract, which I missed in the first time, ribrospinal tract, reticulospinal tract, olivospinal, vestibulospinal and tectospinal tracts. The ascending tracts are fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus gracilis, the dorsolateral tract, the spinocerebellar tract, the spinophthalmic tract and the spino-olivary tract. Note that the names of the tracts begin at which part of the CNS the tract starts from. For example, the descending tracts begin such as corticospinal, hypothalamospinal, tectospinal, etc., indicating that they start above the spinal cord at a particular region like the cortex, the tegmentum or the red nucleus in case of ribrospinal, and they descend down to the spinal cord, which are the motor tracts. Instead, the sensory tracts, they start with a name like spinocerebellar, spino-olivary, spinophthalmic, which means that it starts from the spinal cord and it ends in an inner position above the spinal cord, for example in the cerebellum, the cerebrum, wherever, according to the particular tract. Alright, so we're going to start with the definition of the word tract. A tract is a collection of nerve fibers within the central nervous system which have the same origin, course as well as termination. So the origin, course and the termination of the tracts have to be the same. These can also be called fasciculi or lemnisci. So we'll start with the descending tracts. First, we will begin with the corticospinal tracts. Basically, the corticospinal tracts are two: lateral corticospinal and anterior corticospinal, but I'm dealing with both of them at the same time because they kind of have the same origin. So the origin of the corticospinal tract is the pyramidal cells of Betz, which are present in the Brodmann area 4 and area 6, which double as the motor area and the premotor area. So once they originate from the pyramidal cells of Betz at either area 4 or area 6 Brodmann classification, the course they follow is that they go through the internal capsule, through the corona radiata, reach the cerebral peduncles, go to the pons and then the medulla. 75% of the fibers from of the tract decussate. 25% of the fibers of the tract does not decussate. Decussate means crossing over. So the 75% that does decussate forms the lateral white column, which is called the lateral corticospinal tract, and the 25% that doesn't decussate forms the anterior white column, which is called the anterior corticospinal tract. So basically the lateral corticospinal tract terminates in the lateral white column of the spinal cord, and the anterior corticospinal tract terminates in the anterior white column of the spinal cord. Alright, I'll repeat it once more. The corticospinal tract originates in the pyramidal cells of beds, which can be from either Brodmann area 4 or Brodmann area 6. The course that they follow after their origin is that they pass through the internal capsule, pass through the corona radiator, reach the cerebral peduncles, the pons, and then the medulla. At the medulla and the pyramidal decussation, 75% of the fibers decussate go to the lateral right column of the spinal cord, following the lateral corticospinal tract. And 25% of the fibers do not decussate, they go to the anterior right column and form the anterior corticospinal tract. So the functions of these tracts differ. The lateral corticospinal tract controls skilled voluntary movements and the anterior controls posture. That's it with the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tracts. Next we move on to the rubrospinal tract. The rubrospinal tract originates from the reticular formation, and it's again of two types, lateral and anterior. The reticular formation of the entire brainstem contributes to the lateral reticulospinal tract, which facilitates motor neurons, and it ends in the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. If it's only medullary reticular formation, it forms the anterior reticulospinal tract and it inhibits the motor neurons, but both of them end at the same place, anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. So yeah, these are the descending tracts of the spinal cord, which are pictured here in a very highly schematic manner. Here's the corticospinal tract, here's the tectospinal tract, here's the rubrospinal tract, this is the reticulospinal tract, and here's the vestibulospinal tract. So, a very important clinical question about the descending tract is about the upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron paralysis. So, upper motor neuron is above the level of decussation, and lower motor neuron occurs below the level of decussation. Upper motor neuron paralysis is spastic paralysis. Lower motor neuron paralysis is flaccid paralysis. In case of upper motor neuron paralysis, the Babinski sign is positive. In case of lower motor neuron paralysis, the Babinski sign is negative. The Babinski sign is basically the fanning of toes, the stimulation of extensors instead of flexors when the plantar response is elicited, which is abnormal. In case of upper motor neuron paralysis, there is minimal atrophy of muscles, but lower motor neuron paralysis has very pronounced atrophy of muscles. In case of upper motor neuron paralysis, the tendon reflexes are exaggerated, deep tendon reflexes, and superficial reflexes are absent. But in case of lower motor neuron paralysis, both deep tendon and superficial reflexes are absent. Now we move on to ascending tracts. The first tract we'll deal with is the spinophthalmic tract. So the spinophthalmic tract also has two parts, an anterior spinophthalmic tract and a lateral spinophthalmic tract. So the origin of the anterior tract is the dorsal root ganglion medial. The origin of the lateral spinophthalmic tract is the lateral dorsal root ganglion. Alright, and the course after the origin is a common course almost. It follows the dorsolateral tract of Lesueur. Then the posterior horn cells of the spinal cord, they go to the substantia gelatinosa present in the posterior horn cells of the spinal cord. They decussate in the anterior commissure of the spinal cord, and then they reach the VPL nucleus of the thalamus, the ventero-posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. Alright, the functions of the spinophthalmic tract are the follows. The anterior spinophthalmic tract is for crude touch and pressure. And the lateral spinophthalmic tract senses pain and temperature. Here is a schematic diagram of the spinophthalmic tracts, both the lateral and the anterior. The lateral is illustrated in a reddish orange shade, and the anterior is illustrated in a blue shade. So the physiological importance of the spinophthalmic tract is covered in the physiology of pain, which is a very important topic. Pain is an unpleasant sensory or emotional sensation which is associated with either potential or actual tissue damage. So there are two types of pain when it comes to neuronal senses. One is fast pain and the second is slow pain. A delta fibers carry fast pain and C fibers carry slow pain. Here's the pain pathway. There are two pain pathways. There's a paleospinal pain pathway and a neophthalmic pain pathway. I'm not sure about the names. If I'm wrong, please correct me in the comments. So the paleophthalmic pain pathway sends branches to the hypothalamus, the periaqueductal gray, and the reticular formation, while the neophthalmic pain pathway just goes straight from the from the spinal cord till the sensory cortex. So the newer one, the neophthalmic pathway, it carries fast pain, and the slower one, the older one, the paleophthalmic spine pathway, it carries slow pain. And slow pain also has the effect of keeping the subject awake because of the extensive branching to the reticular formation. So I just told you about a few features of pain. And another thing that we need to keep in mind are the different types of pain that we need to remember. There's visceral pain, deep pain, and referred pain. Visceral pain here refers to the pain felt in the visceral organs, which is dull and diffuse because of the comparative less innervation of pain fibers in visceral organs. Referred pain refers to the pain which is felt in an area which is not the area that has actually acquired tissue damage. There are some theories of referred pain which will be dealt with in a later video, hopefully. But the most accepted theory of there are a lot of theories of referred pain, and that will be dealt with later. Right now we just need to remember that there's something called referred pain, in which case the pain felt is not at the region which has undergone tissue damage in the first place. Alright, so then we go to pain control mechanisms. Pain control mechanisms has it's generally endogenous pain control mechanisms following other pathways that are followed by the pain control mechanisms. The first is the raphispinal pathway, in which is a serotogenic pathway which secretes a substance known as enkephalins that inhibits substance P that causes this feeling of pain, and this pathway is activated by chronic pain. So basically this pathway, it comes from the frontal cortex and the hypothalamus. It relays at the periaqueductal gray, and then the nucleus raphe magnus, which is why it's called raphispinal in the first place, from where it relates to the spinal cord. And then we have the cerebrospinal pathway, which does not give any branches to the periaqueductal gray. It originates from the locus coeruleus of the pons, and it relays in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. A third endogenous pain control mechanism is an endogenous opioid system, which has opioid receptors of classes mu, delta, and kappa. It causes both presynaptic and postsynaptic inhibition of C and A delta fibers, which is caused by substances such as enkephalins, which are also called endorphins, because these receptors can also receive morphine. Morphine is a commonly used opioid, pain reliever. I assume that almost all of us have heard of it in the first place. So these substances that are called endorphins are basically substances that are created by our own body that kind of mimic morphine. Alright, so this is it for the pain control mechanisms. And then we come to the dorsal column pathway. The dorsal column pathway basically deals with the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus craniatus that we talked about in the ascending tracts. Alright. So they originate from the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and then they move on to the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus respectively for fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. Then they relate through the medial lemniscus, pass through the thalamus, and then reach the sensory cortex. The dorsal column pathways generally sense the function of fine touch, proprioception, tactile localization, and tactile discrimination. There are two types of neurons found here: cluster and non-cluster. Cluster neurons relay in the thalamus. Non-cluster neurons do not relay anywhere near the thalamus. And then we go to the next ascending tract, which is the spinocerebellar tract. Here the schematic representation is the same. It originates in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord and it reaches the cerebellum. Alright, so the origin is the dorsal root ganglion, the nucleus dorsalis of the spinal cord, and again there are two parts here, anterior and posterior. So wait, just a second, I don't want to tell the wrong thing. Yeah, so the posterior, the posterior tract, it goes through the dorsolateral spinal cord and reaches the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The anterior tract goes through the ventrolateral spinal cord and reaches the superior cerebellar peduncle. And it terminates both in the ipsilateral, not contralateral cortex of the cerebellum, unlike the other tracts which terminate in the contralateral cortexes. Alright, so the functions of the posterior tract is the gross movements of the lower limb, unconscious proprioception of the gross movements of the lower limb, and the anterior deals with the unconscious proprioception of the fine movements of the lower limb. Okay, so that's it. And then we move on to spinal reflexes. We'll be learning about three reflexes: the stretch reflex, which is called the myotactic reflex, the inverse stretch reflex, which is called the inverse myotactic reflex, and the withdrawal reflex. After which we'll be learning the blood supply of the spinal cord, and with that we'll be ending our chapter. So let's start with the stretch reflex, which is the myotactic reflex. In this reflex, a sustained stretch of a muscle leads to the contraction of the muscle. So there are two types of this reflex. One is the tonic reflex and one is the phasic stretch reflex. So in case of the tonic stretch reflex, the receptor is present in the muscle spindle. In both cases, in the tonic and the phasic reflex, the receptor is present in the muscle spindle. But in case of phasic reflex, both primary and secondary fibers work here. In tonic reflex, the afferent is group 1A neuron. In phasic reflex, the afferent is group 1A and 2A neurons. In case you don't know what receptors and afferent mean, which I doubt, but hey, I might forget the meaning sometimes, so I'm gonna tell you what it is. Receptors is the nerve endings that receive a particular stimulus. So the receptor nerve endings are present in the spindle of the muscle. The afferent are the nerve endings that carry the stimulus to the spinal cord. The afferent are generally the neurons that come from the spinal cord in response to the reflex stimulus. So the reflex arc is common to both the stretch reflexes. One branch of motor neuron terminates monosynaptically on the protagonist neuron, and disynaptical termination of the other branch occurs on the antagonist inhibitory neurons. Here is a schematic diagram of the very same arc, the reflex arc of the myotactic reflex. And then we come to the inverse stretch reflex. Here, when a strong sustained stretch occurs, relaxation takes place. One thing that we need to remember here is the clasp knife phenomenon. In case a person has spastic paralysis, his or her muscles will show the clasp knife phenomenon, in which, in case of a strong stretch, a strong contraction takes place first, causing pain, and then the muscle relaxes if the strong stretch is sustained for a long time. So the receptor here is present in the Golgi tendon organs, and the afferent neurons are group 1b neurons. The arc here is rather simple compared to the first one. It just goes from the group 1b neurons to the inhibitory neurons. And then the third is the withdrawal reflex. This is a little bit complicated, but it's the reflex that we've all heard of the first time. There is a stimulus of pain, and we withdraw our flexors immediately. So the receptor present here is the nociceptor, or the pain receptor. The afferent is obviously the flexor receptor afferents. So the arc here is flexor receptor afferents, which is called FRA. It fires signals to the motor neuron, which excites the flexors, inhibits the extensors, so we automatically withdraw our hands or whichever part of our body is extended to the painful stimulus. So here is a very schematic diagram of the arc. With this, we finish with the reflexes, and we come to the blood supply of the spinal cord. So let's start with the arterial supply. And there are actually two named arteries, the anterior spinal artery and two posterior spinal arteries. So the anterior spinal artery is the union of the spinal branches of vertebral artery, which lie in the anterior median fissure of the spinal cord. There are two posterior spinal arteries, which are branches of vertebral or posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which go to the posterolateral fissure of the spinal cord and then divide into medial and lateral collateral spinal arteries. Here is a labeled diagram of the arterial supply of the spinal cord. You can see the vertebral artery present here, followed by the anterior spinal artery, the deep cervical artery, the lateral sacral artery, and the posterior arteries here: posterior inferior cerebral artery, posterior spinal artery, segmental arteries, and the posterior intercostal arteries. Then we move on to the venous drainage of the spinal cord. So the venous drainage of the spinal cord has two median longitudinal veins, two anterolateral veins, and two posterolateral veins. And here here's a schematic diagram of the venous drainage of the spinal cord. So following are some clinicals which are supposed to be noted. One is the lumbar puncture, the second is the cauda equina syndrome, and then there's Tabes dorsalis, Brown-Séquard syndrome, stringomyelia, and an artery that's present at T11 called the artery of Adam-Puis. With any luck, when I'll be finishing neuroanatomy, I'll have a separate video that will deal with only the clinicals of the particular topics. So with that, we finish today's chapter, which is the spinal cord, and that's it. I hope it was at least somewhat comprehensive, because I tried my best. And if you find any mistakes, please feel free to correct me, because I'm hardly a postgraduate student. I'm a first year student right now. So if anyone does watch this, do comment, like. Yeah, so see ya later. Have fun, guys. I'll just for a closing of the video, I'll focus on every single diagram I just showed. So let's start with the beginning. Here is the positional changes of the cord. Here are the spinal meninges. Here is the tracks of the cord, and these are a very schematic diagram of the descending tracks, which are the motor tracks. And here's the spinophthalmic tract. This is the pain pathway. This is the roughly spinal pathway. These are the spinal reflexes. Spinal reflex, this is a myotactic, inverse myotactic, and withdrawal reflex. Here's the arterial supply, and here's the venous drainage. And do take a note of these clinicals, because with any luck I will be taking a video on them. So we're actually done right now. If you do like it, feel free to like, comment, or wherever you want. So the next video I'll cover is brainstem. Hopefully that will be done by day after tomorrow. See you then. Bye.